Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you and welcome back to our Fountaindale Public Library Genealogy Day. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm from the Fountaindale Public Library here in Bolingbrook. And the third session that we have today is Investigating Infamous Ancestors with Ray Johnson. Ray Johnson is the proprietor of HistoryCop.com. It is a very, very interesting website if you're looking for all sorts of lectures and resources. But on top of that, Ray is one of the most charismatic and informative speakers that I have on court records and crime. And those are two really great things when you're trying to look for ancestors. What is he doing behind? Oh, okay. I thought he might be doing something like getting out handcuffs or something. And I don't know if I deserve that. So today we're going to be talking about investigating infamous ancestors. He also has a lot of really great resources, so please give a warm round of applause to Ray Johnson. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, thanks. Everyone can hear me? Okay, I know we've got a couple mics going. Like you've got a mic, I've got a mic, there's a mic here. So are we all good on the mics? All right, we're good on the mics. So a little bit about myself. First of all, I think you're all glad that Deborah shared that story after lunch, right? So there's probably a reason she shared it after lunch. But my name is Ray Johnson, like Deborah said. I think I've probably met some of you before at different talks that I've given in different libraries, possibly this one. But just a little background on myself. I am a former criminal investigator in DuPage County. When I left police work, I decided to go into my second most favorite hobby, and that was historical research. And I've always been interested in historical research ever since I was, well, roughly 18 years old. The only time I didn't like history was when I was in school. And that's kind of, sorry to all the teachers and history teachers out there, or former history teachers. I'm sure you're great, and I'm sure your students went on to become history teachers themselves. But I wasn't blessed with really good history teachers in that, when I was going to school, you were just memorizing dates and places and names, and you memorized them for the test, and after the test, you just kind of went out the window, and you're like, why do I need to know this stuff? But it wasn't until so genealogy really got me interested in historical research, because I like doing all sorts of historical research, but my start was in genealogy, and I continue to do it. I actually do it professionally for other people, people that, generally with Chicago roots. A lot of my clients come from outside of the Chicago area, and they can't make it here to do the research themselves. But when I was thinking about leaving police work, or after I left police work, I had always thought about writing a book. Only I didn't want to write about police stuff, because I think every cop would like to write a book about the stuff that they did when they were a police officer, which I think every police officer could probably write a book on what they've been through, and some of it very comedic, sometimes, and some very terrifying. But I wanted to write on something different, and so I was at this Borders bookstore when there used to be a Borders bookstore, and unfortunately it's not there anymore. But you do have Barnes and Noble and some of the other ones. But so I was perusing the local history section like I normally do, and I was looking through this book, and a bookmark fell out of it, from the publisher. It was an advertisement. And I bent over and picked it up to put it back in the book, and it said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, oh, it's a sign, right? So I sent off this email to the publisher, and I love Chicago folklore, urban legends, ghost stories, all that kind of stuff. And I thought it'd be interesting to write a book about that kind of thing from an investigator's and a historian's point of view. In other words, not just retell ghost stories, but find out where it started from, how it changed over the years, and how much is fact versus fiction. So it was a lot of fun doing. One of the stories I did was on Resurrection Mary, and I found out that the most hate mail I ever got at any one time was when I was doing the research on Resurrection Mary, if you can believe that. It's about a ghost story. But people were getting mad at me because as I was doing the research, I was putting on a blog. I wrote a blog for Chicago Now, which is owned by the Tribune. If you go on there, you can just search Chicago History Cop and then subscribe, and you'll find out when I publish new stuff. But as I was going through the research, I'm saying, well, this person could have been Resurrection Mary, or because one of the big things was who was Resurrection Mary in life. And so I was coming up with different options to what people considered the top three, and I got all sorts of hate mail from people. I mean, just belligerent, and I mean, mostly crazy people, which is, you know, and after a while they went away, but I was like, you know, I write about a lot of stuff, and as a cop I did a lot of things that people didn't like, and that was probably the most hate mail I ever got was on a ghost story, but kind of strange. But anyway, as far as what we're going to be talking about today is investigating infamous ancestors, because I kind of like, I don't know about you guys, but I like to dig up a lot of dirt in the family because that's where some of the fun stuff is, you know, the stuff that nobody wanted to talk about. And I can't talk to my parents and stuff about it, you know, I've gotten in trouble a couple of times. But so I'm going to show you guys kind of how to get in trouble yourselves as far as finding this information out. So some of you may already know, and maybe you just want to know a little bit more, and some of you may have no idea. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So what I like to do is use case studies. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll go to these repositories, different repositories, and I'll think, what would be a fun project to do to really get involved in some serious research and see what I could dig up that nobody knows about. Now, this isn't particularly about my relatives, but it's about an individual who, I mean, some of you may know this person if you recognize the face. Anybody? Oh, we got a couple. What was it? Holmes, H.H. Holmes, yeah, Herman Webster Mudgett. So what, there we go, Herman Webster Mudgett, AKA Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Now, this topic that we're going to be talking about, I'm going to start off using Holmes because that'll take us through kind of the late 1800s, and then after that I'm going to switch gears so we can talk about some of the more recent stuff that you may want to dig up. But with Herman Webster Mudgett, for those of you who aren't familiar, he was, there was a great book written by Eric Larson called Devil in the White City. That's how most people were introduced to him. He was, a lot of newspapers and periodicals like to point to him as America's first serial killer. I tend to differ. I think there were probably serial killers long before 1893. And I also disagree that he was a serial killer in the strictest sense. I think he was more like an opportunistic sociopath. In other words, a serial killer is driven by the urge to kill, and that's kind of their main goal, is the thrill of the kill and whatever gratification they get out of it. Holmes was more of a con man. He was more in it for the money and the women, and then if he needed to kill someone in the process, he was okay with it. So that's kind of where I kind of draw the line. But historically speaking, today is an interesting day to do this talk on, because today is May 7th, and that's the day that Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison. So happy Holmes Execution Day for all of you. Now he had a number of different aliases. This is just a few of them. I think there's somewhere upwards of about 30. I don't have a master list. I do have people that have been compiling a master list. But these are just some of them. O.C. Pratt, Hiram S. Campbell, A.S. Yates, Harry Gordon, H.M. Howard, H. Howe, Alexander Bond, Robert Phelps, Frank Wilde, and my favorite, Waldo Bunkhorn. I think he was just tired of using really common names and thought it'd be fun to use something like this. But he used a number of aliases, which makes it a lot more difficult to kind of track what he was doing. So the way I kind of went about it is the Devil in the White City. And what he was mainly known for within this book is that he built a building in Chicago. I mean, he did a number of other things as well. Let me go back. But he had created this building at 63rd and Wallace in Chicago in time for the World's Fair. So interesting guy. Now, his normal swindle was insurance swindles. So in other words, if you were a female, he would befriend you, you'd become boyfriend and girlfriend, he would convince you to take out an insurance policy for 10 grand every time. I don't know why he used that number, but it was always 10 grand. And you know, eventually convinced the woman to take it out, make him the beneficiary, and then all of a sudden she would disappear and, you know, visited relatives in Wichita somewhere and never came back. So in other words, he would just bump them off and then take the insurance money. He did this over and over and over again. Now, if you were a guy, back then he couldn't use the same type of swindle. He didn't care if you were male or female as long as he could make money. But he couldn't be your boyfriend back in 1896. So what he would do is say, we're going to go in this together. I'm a doctor, which he was, which again is another reason why I don't believe him to be a typical serial killer, is that most of them don't have the attention span to finish a degree, but he did go to the University of Michigan. He was a doctor, at least by the standards back in 1885 when he graduated. So there was no board to pass. You just got your little certificate, hung up your sign, and you were a doctor. But he did finish school, probably cheated most of his way through. But he made it to Chicago, built this building at 63rd and Wallace. And like I said, if you were a guy, he would say, okay, we're gonna go on this thing together, and I have access to cadavers at the medical school, so I'll find a cadaver that's about your shape and size. Okay, so if you take out an insurance policy, as me as the beneficiary, we're gonna put this body in this building, burn it down, and then we're gonna fake your death, and then we'll split the money. Only with Holmes, he never split the money with anybody. He wouldn't even go out and get a cadaver. He'd wait for him to sign the insurance policy, and then he would torch that person in the building and collect the whole 10 grand. So, but he never paid for anything. He was sued multiple times. When he built this building, it was amazing. It was at 63rd and Wallace. It was a 3-story building, and he never paid a dime to have the building built. And the way he did that is that back in the 1880s, there was a law in Chicago that said that if you hired a crew and fired them within a week, you didn't have to pay them. And the reason for that was that if you had a lousy crew, then if you fired them, you didn't have to give them any money. So, but of course, Holmes took advantage of that, and he'd have a new crew every week, so he'd never pay anybody. So it accomplished 2 different things. One, he didn't have to pay for anything, and 2, nobody knew what the entire building looked like from start to finish. So it was pretty ingenious, actually. Pretty smart guy. Now, I'm gonna get into exactly the research I did on Holmes using some of the court documents that we're gonna talk about. But one of the best ways that you can look up infamous ancestors, not any ancestors at all, really. And I kind of felt funny putting this in here because it's so obvious, Google. But a lot of people aren't aware of Google Books. And Google Books is, let me put the little, there we go. You can actually go to Google and just click on books. For some reason, I've had better success typing in the whole address and going directly to books before I do the search. So, and in your handouts, I have this, so you don't have to worry about writing it down. But books.google.com. It's pretty simple. And you have access to a huge store of digitized books that are out of copyright. So we're talking older stuff. If it's over 100 years old, it's out of copyright. So they'll digitize these from libraries all over. So there's some books in here that you would have had to gone to the Newberry Library or Fort Wayne or some of these the bigger research libraries in order to get access to these books that are now on Google. And one of the books that I had found, which was interesting, and there's journals and there's periodicals on here as well, was a journal of the American Medical Association. And in that, there was a doctor who visited Holmes in prison and did a complete medical workup on him. Which I thought was phenomenal. You know, a lot of background information, physical information, physical descriptions that you wouldn't even dream of getting on people. But then this was, I just took some bits and pieces of it. It was a huge volume, and there was about 3 or 4 pages written on Holmes himself. And you can do this for any one of your relatives. You never know what sort of information you can get on Google Books. I'm serious. It's you know, who knows? You may have had a relative that was in prison, and some doctor came to, you know, because there were a lot of studies going on to decide how someone becomes a criminal or insane, and a lot of doctors were making comparisons of your skull or scars or what sort of trauma you had as a kid. So they're all trying to figure out how someone becomes a criminal, and so they would visit these criminals in prison, and the Journal of the AMA was one of these. And Herman Webster Mudgett was being interviewed and examined in prison, and it actually goes into his family history. He interviewed him. Now, of course, Holmes, if his mouth was moving, he was lying, so you got to take everything that Holmes said with a grain of salt. It was all half-truths with him. This is a photo that was taken of him actually in one of his booking photos at Moyamensing prison. They actually had a cast of his teeth in this article, which is really interesting because I know there's some theories out there that Holmes was never really executed, that he had paid somebody off that was about his shape and size who was going to hang anyway, and that this person would hang, and then Holmes would get, pay off the jail guards and get out of jail. That was actually his great-grandfather or great-grandson who came up with that theory, and I did have a chance to meet with him, talk about him a little bit later. It was in a very public place, by the way, when we got a chance to meet. He actually contacted me because I do free tours over in Jackson Park on the White City, and he had never visited the White City where his great-grandfather had been, involved with. He never actually, as far as we know, had any direct involvement with the White City. It was Eric Larson's kind of marrying the two. But he did operate in Chicago at the same time. Now, he believes that his grandfather had gotten away, and he wanted to have the body exhumed to do a DNA analysis to see if the DNA matched. And I'm like, well, you got your teeth right here. I mean, if you're only assuming that there's a paternal link between Holmes and you. I mean, genealogically there is, because as soon as this guy contacted me and said, "Oh, I'm the great-grandson of Herman Mudgett," being a genealogist, I was like, okay, sure. So I did the whole workup, and yeah, if his father is who he says he is, then he's a legitimate great-grandson of Holmes, which is why I met him in a very public location, because you never know how much of that, how far the apple falls from the tree. So, but if they do dig up the body and they, for some reason they can't get DNA or it's spoiled, you've got the guy's dental records basically right here in this journal of the American Medical Association. This I thought was kind of cute. This is one of the, some of the stuff I can't even talk about because they go into such medical detail. It's kind of, I guess, inappropriate. But this one statement was pretty funny. It says, "In 20 years' experience, I have never observed a more degenerate being from a physical standpoint. Holmes, in his confession published, stated that 10 years ago he was examined by 4 men of marked ability and by them pronounced mentally and physically normal and healthy. Today I have every attribute of a degenerate, immoral idiot." So this is a photo of the what they deemed the murder castle in Chicago. This is the building that Holmes had built over at 63rd and Wallace. On the first floor there were businesses. Second floor was where you didn't want to go. Third floor was normal rooms. Second floor were his killing rooms, or if he wanted to do away with you, he would give you a room on the second floor, and he had certain rooms that were gas piped, where he can run gas in there at night and kill you that way, or he had furnaces, he had chutes leading to the basement. He had all sorts of things. And so we'll talk about getting photographs of infamous ancestors and where you can find out some of this information. This photo was actually from the Chicago Tribune. This is one of the best photos I've ever seen. Prior to the Tribune digging into their archives and pulling this out and putting it online, on the Chicago Tribune online, the best photograph was a very grainy photograph from the Chicago History Museum. So this is fairly new, and it was very, very good. And you can actually read the signs in the windows when you zoom in. I can't in the presentation, but if you were to go to Chicago Tribune, you could download the photo and actually zoom into some of the businesses that were located. Now this is a lot later than Holmes. This is in the 1930s. There were rumors that the building had burned down after Holmes hightailed it out of Chicago. Once I figured out what he was up to, there were rumors that the building had burned down or that Holmes had burned it down. There was a fire, and he probably did attempt to burn it down, but it didn't work. So the building was up until about 1938 when they tore it down for the post office that's there now. I went backwards. Didn't want to do that. So there were layouts done as the police officers went in after they figured out what he was doing all across the world, actually. He had been into Canada, New Jersey, Vermont, Texas. I think he was involved in England, and we'll get into a little bit of that, why I think he was in England. I don't think he was Jack the Ripper. That was another one of the theories out there, that Holmes was Jack the Ripper, and he was way too busy here in 1888, in my opinion. Plus the MO was completely different. Holmes didn't want to get caught. Jack the Ripper kind of played with the police and left bodies mangled where anyone could find them. Holmes, if he got rid of someone, would generally strip the body of skin and then sell the skeleton to the local medical college. So it's all about the money. I mean, you're not going to let anything go to waste. So there were various floor plans done of the second floor primarily. Like I said, third floor, if you stayed there in the hotel, during the World's Fair and you got the third floor, you were pretty good to go. First floor is mainly business. The second floor is where all his hijinks went on, and his office was on the second floor as well. So he had all sorts of strange secret rooms and chambers, gas chambers, like I said, chutes that went from the second floor all the way to the basement. That's where they got kind of the idea for what's the thing, the movie with Johnny Depp that used to be a play, where it was this English killer, he was a barber. Help me out here.
Sweeney Todd.
Sweeney Todd, yes. So there's that scene where Sweeney Todd kind of has him in the barber chair and tips him over and he goes on the chute to the basement. That's where they got the idea for that, was from the Holmes story. But yeah, interesting guy. So on this blow up, you can see you have the waiting room and reception room, which is pretty much like his office and the waiting room. And then you've got secret chambers, dark room, 5-door room, whatever, mysterious closed room. There were rooms that had no windows and blind rooms, and some of it was probably by accident because these people that every week a different crew was in there. So, but some of it was definitely by design. So, where do you get some of these photographs? Where do you look for some of the photographs and some of these stories and diagrams? This is one of my favorite photos of opening day at the Chicago World's Fair, and it's actually part of a stereograph. And I like this because, well, everyone looks like Holmes. I mean, everyone that sees this photo sees the bowler cap and a mustache, and I think everyone in the world has tried to look in this photo to see if they can find Holmes somewhere in the crowd. But you do find some interesting things in the crowd, like I circled this guy over here, and the blow up. Here, let me. These two individuals cracked me up. So that guy, his tie's on too tight, you know. So you figure someone's taking these 3D photographs. This is a stereo view, so it's like the ones you stick into little things and see the 3D views. So this guy has no idea a picture's been taken, and 130 years later, we're sitting here looking at him trying to fix his tie. The second one was this woman who's she's just glad to be there. I don't know. So mostly men if you see mostly men in the group, but she's just having a good old time. I don't know what's going on, or someone behind, maybe the guy behind her is reaching somewhere where he shouldn't be. But so that particular one you can get at the New York City Library Digital Collections. So a lot of times the New York Library just released a whole bunch of Chicago fire photos that are in the public domain now, and these are very high quality TIFF files that you can download for free and use. Now, I'm not saying that you can use them, if you're looking to publish something, you still need permissions, and you need to contact them. And at the very least, even if it's in the public domain, you should say where you got it from. You should cite, courtesy of New York Public Library. But for personal use, it's all downloadable. And they've got a huge collection of photos at the New York Digital Library Collections. And all these websites are also, you don't have to take notes, they're all in the handouts. But I just want to go over a few of them. There's so many out there now because there's libraries and it's getting cheaper for storage and whatnot, and people are getting into more digitizing some of the stuff. You never know what you can find. And, obviously when you're searching some of these sites, the easiest thing would be to put in your relative's name, but chances are you're not going to find them that way. You'd have to know like what groups they're a part of, at what point might they have had their picture taken. So there may be stuff that they've digitized from an insurance company or from a club that they belong to. So you have to kind of try to outsmart the computer as far as how you think these photos may have been indexed when you're doing the searches. Chicago History Museum has a great online collection. They're digitizing more and more of their photographs. Now, you really have to be careful with them. They charge if you're going to publish anything from their archives. So, but if it's just for your own personal use, again, they wouldn't put it up there if they didn't want you to download it. Just be cautious if you're going to publish anything. But not all of their photographs are online. Again, when you see these sites like the New York Public Library or the Harold Washington Library or the Chicago History Museum, only a small portion usually of all their photographs are digitized. So you may have to break down and actually go there and look through folders and do it the old-fashioned way. I know the Chicago History Museum has a great way of, they've got different intersections done. So if you have a location where something was and you wanted to find an old photo of that particular location, if you know the intersection, you can go to the Chicago History Museum and they've got it separated by intersection. So you may have a folder of photographs taken for a particular place, and that's how they have it organized. You won't find that online. You actually have to go there and look through folders. So. But some of it's online. Now this one, Explore Chicago, this is a combination of a number of different universities and organizations that put information and digitize it. It's not all photos, they could be pamphlets, posters, whatever. One of the bigger ones is the University of Illinois at Chicago has their digitized collections on this consortium. And they've got a lot of great photos of the 1933 fair. So if you're looking for photos of that fair, this would be the place to go. They've got a huge collection of those photos, really neat. In fact, I'm looking to use a couple photos for another book I'm working on. So, Chicago Tribune. Now, they actually have, it's a little bit harder to find. If you go to their website, you go to, they have sections. You can do a verbal search, but a lot of times it's by category. But they'll have what they call kind of a gallery file, and that's where I found the Holmes. They just happened to do a Holmes gallery, as you can see in the photo here, on just to the lower right-hand side. And that's where they displayed some of the photos that nobody had ever seen before, including them. They didn't know what they had in their archives, and every once in a while they'll go down and they'll see maybe something will hit the news, and they'll say, well, let's see if we have any old photos of this. And they'll go down there and they'll put it online. So that's really neat. Now, of course, the Library of Congress has a huge prints and photographs section, and this, of course, is all over the country. So they've got stuff, and just because you're searching an archive that's out of state doesn't mean they're not going to have Chicago stuff, because it doesn't mean that everything in Chicago is in Chicago. Like I said, the New York Library has a huge amount of just released photos of the Chicago fire, which we may not have in Chicago, and it's in New York. Someone collected them, passed away, and donated them all to New York. So you need to look everywhere if you're looking for photos. But Library of Congress has a great prints and photograph selection. Again, some of it is public domain, some of it isn't. When you get to the photo, if it's something that you're interested in, it'll have a little section on what the rights or copyright issues are. Some of them may say there aren't any copyright issues. In that case, you're free to use it, but they'll say exactly how they want it cited in your document. And another one is University of Chicago photo archives. They have their own photo archives. And of course, if you're interested in the World's Fair of 1893, like I am, University of Chicago was around at that point. In fact, they were just starting their new location there in Hyde Park at the same time the fair was going on. So there's a lot of photos of the 1893 exposition on the University of Chicago's photo archives. And of course, it covers a lot of Hyde Park area and Woodlawn area. So a lot of it has to do also with neighborhoods. So if you're looking for photos of a restaurant your ancestor may have owned, it's good to know what neighborhood it was in. And they may not have it indexed by restaurant name. You might have to go through a whole collection of those neighborhood photos, and just by chance you happen to come across a photo of your relative's establishment. Now the second thing is I think you are all really aware of, is newspapers. Ever since they started digitizing the Chicago Tribune, newspapers are a great source of information for infamous relatives. So if you have an infamous relative who is a shyster or they make the news. So you're going to find a lot of good information in the newspapers. And especially the further you go back, the newspaper guys were actually more investigators than the cops were. So the newspaper guys were more true investigators. The cops back in Holmes's day, most of them got their job as a political, giveaway. And they said, oh, we're going to make you a cop. Here's your badge, here's your stick. Go out and bust some heads and, have fun. So there wasn't a whole lot of formal training. Now, a journalist, when actually was going out trying to find the story, the cop was just kind of doing his thing. So, and sometimes it's a little bit that way. I'm like, no, I can say that, but you can't say that. So as far as newspapers, ProQuest, most libraries have access to ProQuest. Again, not everything's digitized, but ProQuest has, the Chicago Tribune if you're looking for local stuff. I'm sure you guys have Chicago Tribune digitized?
And historic and
historic newspapers and current. So yeah, most libraries do have it. The Tribune, what I like to do is, the Tribune wasn't the only paper in the world, but it was one of the first ones to be digitized and indexed. So what I like to do is look for it first in the Chicago Tribune, the easiest way, and then use that date and then go back through all the old newspapers the old-fashioned way, through microfilm that haven't been digitized, because now you have the date and you can narrow it down that you wouldn't have before. So a lot of times I use the Tribune to do that. Some of the other ones that are digitized that are Chicago local papers are Chicago Defender from 1910 to 1975. The Chicago Tribune we talked about, 1849, which is great, huge resource because we know most of the records in Chicago kind of went up in smoke in 1871, so it's really neat to have that back to 1849. Chicago Examiner, not so much of that. And then of course they have Chronicling America, which is part of the Library of Congress, which you can get for free anyway on the Library of Congress site. So there are different ways of doing this. I like cheap ways of doing it because genealogy can be a pretty expensive undertaking. So, you know, cheap is good, free is better. So, and again, Library of Congress has the historic newspapers that they've been digitizing over time. And that covers a lot of different areas in the United States. Now, I signed up for newspapers.com. Has anyone else signed up for newspapers.com? Yeah, I like it. It gives you a lot more than the Library of Congress. You do pay for it, but it's not all that expensive. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was something like $14 a month or something like that. But they have a lot of digitized newspapers from all over the country, small local newspapers, some of them really old, some of them current. So they keep adding to it all the time, but it's a great resource. It's neat to see how different papers cover different stories. And some papers were more visual and had more photos and more diagrams. Other papers were, like the Inner Ocean, was very textural, so it's not as pretty to look at. But each of them had their own way of looking at a story. Now going back to Holmes. So that's how you get some of the photos like I got of Holmes's castle, some of the stuff from Google Books as far as Holmes. There's a lot more, but we've got a lot to cover in a short period of time. So just to kind of give you a feeling of what's out there. Now one of the cases that I looked into about Holmes is using the Cook County Clerk of the Court, Circuit Court Archives. Anybody ever been to the Circuit Court Archives? A couple people? Okay, great resource of information, very overlooked. A lot of people don't even know about it. They're not like really advertised. Great group of people. I've been, you know, made friends with a lot of them. I've been there for probably the last 10 years doing research in their office. So they know me really well. Phil Costello runs it. Great guy. Terrible on the phone. So if you call them, you're going to get, you know, they're not very nice on the phone. I hate to say it. They're really great in person. But I hear them answer the phone all the time when I'm there, and I'm like, man, if I was that person, I'd be like, you know, calling your boss or whatever. I don't know what it is about talking on the phone, but so I suggest you actually go there. Now, where it's located is actually in the Daly Center downtown, and these two guys here kind of made the Daly Center famous. Most of you that are from Chicago know why these two guys made it famous. I usually, when I'm giving the tours in Jackson Park, one of the bridges from Jackson Park is actually used in the movie, The Blues Brothers. It was supposed to be Marquette Park, you know, that scene with the Nazis where they're sitting in the car and they're blocking their way, and Jake, or Elwood, turns to Jake and says, yeah, Nazis, I hate Illinois Nazis. And then they gun it, and they go over the bridge, and the Nazis have to jump off the bridge into the pond. That's actually in Jackson Park, that bridge. It's not in Marquette Park. So. Yeah, there we go. So, yeah, I think it still holds the record for the most number of Chicago police cars destroyed in a single movie. In fact, and Jane Byrne was good with it because the production company paid for all new police cars. So they're like, yeah, here's a few more. You know, wreck those too. But these are the type of documents that you can get at the archives. And none of these are digitized except for the naturalizations per se. The naturalizations are more or less on Ancestry, at least the indexes, not the naturalizations themselves. I know Fold 3 is going through naturalizations now. They're nowhere near completed. They're working with the National Archives. But for the most part, all these you actually have to go there and get. So this is the good stuff, you know, that you actually have to dig for, like divorce records and probates and wills, civil suits. You know, like Holmes, even though he was a criminal, was never charged criminally for anything in Chicago, but he was sued over and over again. So there's a lot of civil suits having to do with Holmes, but no criminal files, if you can believe that. So you've got a printout, excuse me, you've got a printout of exactly what they have, so we won't get into exactly all that they have. We're going to concentrate primarily on the civil and criminal, but there's a lot of stuff in divorce. I mean, as you can imagine. So if you're looking up some dirt on the family, those divorce files are awesome. Yes?
I went there for the naturalization and, you know, handed in the file number. 3 minutes later, I'm there with the original of my, you know.
Yep. It's all original. Yeah, the only thing that's on microfilm are the indexes. But when you go there and they give it to you, like I said, yours is probably in a big book that they brought out, or possibly in a file. Yeah, it depends on how old they are. The older ones are actually bound into volumes, and they bring the whole big book out there for you to look at. So when you go down there, actually, you can bring your cell phone. You're going to have to go through a metal detector because it's a courthouse. It's an active courthouse, but it's only civil cases down at the Daly Center. So they allow you to bring your cell phone in, and you can take photos of the things using your cell phone, but they won't let you bring a camera in. And don't try arguing with the deputies at the front door why that's so stupid, because they'll just look at you like this until you give them your camera. But you can take your cell phone, so, or whatever. So cameras leave in the car, cell phones you can bring, even though the camera on my cell phone is better than probably any camera I have. But so if you go down there, just some little tips here. There's self-parking, which is really expensive. It's probably even more than $40 since I updated that slide. So what I like to do, I generally like to take the train. So the self-park's about a block away, the closest one. That's over in the theater district. The Daly Center is basically at 55 West Washington, not too far from the Ford Theater, Goodman Theater. What I like to do is take the Metro down there. It's $10 now round trip. It's a little bit of a walk, about 3/4 of a mile, but given, if it's not 10 below zero, then it's generally a decent walk. There you go, there's my little train icon. I worked really hard on that. Train icon, and then the little judge icon. I thought that was kind of nice. So it is a courthouse. This is not a photograph of the actual Daly Center. They frown on me standing in the foyer by the security desk taking pictures. But that's just something I grabbed online. But you will have to go through a metal detector and stuff like that. So make sure you don't have a little knife on your keychain and all that kind of stuff. This is what it looks like from the outside. It's not the biggest place in the world. It's just a small little office on the 11th floor. They do have some microfilm readers, but it's usually a two-part process. You go down there, you look up the index on microfilm, and then you order the file. And then they have to go to the warehouse and bring it back, and that usually takes about a week. Except with naturalizations, they have all that right there. So if it's a naturalization you're looking for, because prior to 1923, someone could register at the Cook County Courthouse, and they may not be at the federal documents. It might be a local document. So make sure when you're checking those indexes, I'm sure you're all familiar with Ancestry. I kind of made it a goal of this talk not to talk at all about Ancestry, because I'm sure everyone's sick and tired about hearing about Ancestry. But one thing they're good for is that index of all the naturalizations that include the local courts as well as the federal courts for, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Iowa. And just make sure when you look at the court on that index that you're looking at, if it says Cook County Superior Court, then you know the naturalization's here. If it says U.S. District Chicago, then you know it's at the federal archives, National Archives, Great Lakes, over at 73rd and Pulaski. So there's two different locations. So before you head out there, make sure you look at which court they naturalized in. This is just a little layout of the place itself. Not a big deal. I did put the little thing about best film reader. So there's one of the microfilm readers that's the best one. It's the one closest to the file cabinets. It's the smallest one. You wouldn't think it's the best one. So if you go down there, make sure to grab that one first. The other two are okay, but this one has a better, where it says best film reader, that has the best magnification. So what I did with Holmes is, I know he had been sued a number of times under a number of different aliases, but I was interested in whether or not he had sued somebody. Would this guy have enough gumption to actually take someone to court and sue them after everything he's done? I would think he would want to avoid the courthouse at all costs. So I did find one, and I'm going to go through that just to kind of show you where that rabbit hole led me. This did not have to do with Holmes. When you're looking through the civil cases, it's good to know about what time frame that you're looking for a particular thing. So in other words, if you knew, maybe you don't know about any type of lawsuit that happened between your relative and somebody else. They could have been sued, they could have sued somebody else. You may not even be aware of it. So the thing is that the way their microfilm is organized is that it's by court, so it's by superior or circuit court. It could have happened in either one of the local courts. And then it's by date. So you might have one microfilm that covers, like a 3-year range. So, and then it's alphabetical. So in other words, you may be looking through a number of microfilms in order to find something on your relative if all you know is they lived there from 1890 to 1930. That's an awful lot of microfilms to look through, and there is no master index. But that's why some of this stuff is so neat, because no one else has seen it before, because no one wants to go through all of that work to dig it up. But once you do find them, there's a file number that appears, and there's no way to print out the microfilm indexes. That's why I had to take a picture of that to kind of show you what's on it. But on the left-hand side, there's a case number, and that'll be the year, so you'll have some idea of the year, 19S for Superior. And then the case number, you fill out a form, you hand it in, you call them about a week later and say, is my file in? And they will have the original file from the warehouse, everything that was contained in the civil suit that involved your relatives. And there's a lot of information in there. I found out a whole lot of stuff. So back to Holmes, to kind of keep it interesting. So I did find one case where he had sued somebody under the name H.H. Holmes. So I was like, okay, let's see what's in there. And it wasn't a very big file. It was one little tiny thin folder. One of the documents in it I thought was particularly interesting was this promissory note. And normally you're going to see copies of stuff in the files, and they didn't have Xerox machines. So what they would do is they would handwrite a copy of the document to put in the court file. But this is an actual original. This is one of the few ones where I've actually found the original promissory note in the court file, which means he probably didn't follow through on the case. He very seldom followed through on anything, but he would force people into giving him money by just suing them, and they would settle. But I was curious as to who he would have sued and who would have ticked off Holmes enough and got away with it enough to actually be brought into court and sued. So as I'm reading through it, I see the promissory note, and I see that the person who signed it was using the name J.L. Connor. So that kind of made me think, who is this J.L. Connor person? Well, Julia Connor was one of the few proven victims of H.H. Holmes. I mean, people have said he may have killed hundreds of people. I don't particularly believe that. There's more like probably 6 to 9 people that they can really say Holmes killed in all of his exploits. But he was very careful about not being caught, so it could be a lot higher than that. But Julia Connor was a woman who, she was married. Her husband's name was Ned. She had a daughter named Pearl. I think Pearl was about 3 or 4 years old, maybe 5. And Ned was hired by Holmes to run the jewelry counter in one of the stores that he had on the first level. Now Holmes really liked Julia and came up with this plan to make Ned think that him and Julia had something going on the side that would tick off Ned and make him leave Julia. So that's what he did. Even though nothing was going on at the time, he made Ned believe that something was. Ned got mad and left like Holmes had planned. Ned went back home to, I can't remember, he was out of state. And so then he hired Julia and said, well, you can take your husband's spot. So now he had his victim all lined up, and he never paid anybody for anything. So like even his employees, he would figure out a way not to pay them. And what happened with Julia is that he said, well, rather than me giving you the money, paying you, why don't I do this? I take the money that I would have paid you, and I put it into like a fund, and then eventually you'll have enough money to become a partner with me. So, and she said, oh, that's a good idea. So, and she had a place to live, gave her a place to live in the castle and whatnot. So, so she thought it was a great idea. Holmes didn't have to pay her. And so, so this is kind of like, I think she was still alive at this point, and she wasn't coughing up some money or something that he owed him or whatnot. But she eventually disappeared, and her daughter. So he killed both of them. This is a picture of Julia, or actually a sketch of Julia Connor, and that's her daughter Pearl. And yeah, another strange chapter. This is from the Chicago Tribune. Mrs. Connor and a girl have disappeared, last seen with Holmes. What I thought was interesting is on the back of the promissory note was original signatures of Holmes. So they have this original document at the Cook County Archives that they let me just fiddle with, which has his original signatures all over the back of the document. And the way I kind of made sure that those were his signatures, he was keeping track of this money on the back of the promissory note. and you can see signed H.H. Holmes, is that he had done a confession to the Hearst newspapers. He got paid for it. After he'd been convicted of killing the only person he ever hung for, Ben Peitzel, who is one of his associates. Is that me? That better not be me. Turn that off. One of his associates was killed in Philadelphia. Well, the Hearst newspapers thought it'd be really neat to get a confession from him after he was already convicted, so he really had nothing to lose, and they paid him $1,700 while he was in prison to write this confession. So in the confession, he signs the confession, and it's obviously the same signature that's on both documents. So the only thing that was in here was that promissory note and a little explanation as to what the promissory note was for. And it says Harry H. Holmes, which wasn't even really his true alias, it was Henry Howard Holmes, for the use of William Green and Henry J. Rogers, who are partners doing business as William Green and Company. So I'm like, I'd never heard this. I'd read a lot about Holmes. I'd researched a lot about Holmes. And I'm like, well, here's a business I had never heard of that Holmes was involved with that was supposedly taking place in the castle. Well, there were no other businesses but Holmes' businesses in the castle. So this was some bogus thing he had made up in order to justify this money that J.L. Connor was supposed to be giving him, and it was supposed to be paying for this William Green and Company that was for rent at his murder castle. So now it's like, and Holmes was full of this. I mean, to follow him is like, it should be a case study for police departments, because after about 3 weeks of doing research, I got a splitting headache, because it was like one of the things he would do is he'd start a business with somebody, and he'd always have a dupe. There would be someone who had actual money involved, and then it would be himself, usually under a fake name, and sometimes one of his associates who would also have a fake name. And these three guys would get together, form a company, and then he would go off and form another company with another dupe. And then he would sue one company by virtue of the other company, and then once he won the lawsuit, he would basically bleed the one company of the money and then take it, and then the one poor guy that actually had the money would lose out. And he would just keep creating these businesses and then sue each other. So it's phenomenal. And trying to trace that it gives you a headache. But so anyway, so I was like, who is this William Green? Who is Henry Rogers? Are they real people? Are these Confederates of Holmes? Are they aliases of Holmes himself? So on one of the subpoenas, they were looking to subpoena Green, and the subpoena said 63rd and Wallace upstairs. Okay, and I know no one was upstairs other than Holmes and dead people that eventually ended up in the basement. So I started looking through the Chicago Tribune, trying to figure out if there really was a William Green and Company, and what their business was, and was it related somehow to Holmes. Well, in Chicago Tribune of 1891, I see a William Green and Company, but the address 544 to 554 North Water Street. And of course, now you're using Sanborn fire maps and old maps that you can get on the Chicago History Museum's website, where you can kind of trace where these old addresses actually existed, because the addresses changed. In 1909, most of the residential addresses changed. In 1911, all the addresses downtown changed. So if you're looking at an address prior to that, you need to convert it to whatever the address would be today to actually find a location. So if you weren't aware of that, that's something to keep in mind. But I found this William Green Company, so I thought, okay, it might actually be an actual company. It says for storage and general warehouse for merchandise, dock, and railroad facilities. Kind of generic. So I went and traced where it was, and using Sanborn fire maps, and this building more than likely burned down as well. Holmes had a way of, if he was involved in a business, it would eventually burn down. When he was done with it, he'd have insurance on it, he'd make money off the insurance company. So this little red star is where this building should have been in 1891 when the business was going on. And in advertising had access to both the railroad track and the Chicago River. And they were involved in the purchase and sale of cement. So you can put two and two together, that if Holmes is actually taking cement into a warehouse in a very industrial area of Chicago and had access to the Chicago River, put two and two together. I'm guessing that there's probably a lot of cement blocks in the bottom of the Chicago River that contain people that Holmes didn't like very much. So I kind of set off to find out if William Green was an actual person. So you can see how this little promissory note can kind of take you down a rabbit hole, and if you pay attention to the small details. So I find this thing on William Green. Again, I don't know if it's the same William Green. It seems like a fake name to me. But anyway, so I read in the newspaper that there was a William Green from England who also has an alias Francis Green, who'd worked a confidence game, sounds like Holmes, on Gerard J. Riddle, a farmer boy, and has issued a writ for Green's arrest to restrain his departure from this company. It's feared that Riddle's attorney that the writ has been secured too late and that Green is on his way back to England. So that led me to another suit. Since I knew it was a lawsuit, I wanted to find out who William Green and Gerard Riddle were. So I went back, and there were a lot more information on this one. And then it mentions exactly when they came, Riddell, or Riddle, if you want to pronounce it that way. Again, I thought maybe that was a fake name with the last name Riddle. That'd be something Holmes would try. And not to get too deep into this, but like I said, it gets really, really complicated. But anyway, so this was a statement supposedly by the victim of William Green. Okay, so this is, as I'm trying to find out William Green, I find out that supposedly he had ripped off a young boy named Gerard Riddell. And we're going to find out, what they were involved with. So it says, your order being engaged at Mount St. Mary's College near Chesterfield, Derbyshire, England, and then being acquainted with the son of the defendant, William Green. So basically, when I looked up Mount St. Mary's College in Derbyshire, England, it was basically a high school. You wouldn't go much older than 18 years old would be the max age that even today they take students. And it was around back then. It was an actual college, and it was in the location. So I'm thinking, okay, they know the area, or at least this Gerard or whoever this person is knows the area. But he was a farmer boy. Even the newspaper said he was a young boy. Now they mention in here when he came from England with William Green as he was getting ripped off. And basically in a nutshell, we won't go through all the documents, but supposedly this William Green had gone to England with another person, Francis Green, which was also one of his aliases, and met this boy, or supposedly this boy had met his son at this Mount St. Mary's College. This William Green convinces this young boy's father, Gerard Riddell's father, that the U.S. is needing farmers. And if you want to make money in farming, you need to go to the United States. And he knew how to do it. He knew where all the good property was. So he convinced the father to let William Green take his son to the United States and get him all set up. And of course, it would cost money to do that. So the father had to hand over some cash initially. And then once they got to the United States, they supposedly continued to write letters to the father saying, well, we need a little bit more money, we need a little bit more money. And now this is going to court because supposedly this victim, Gerard Riddell, is now realizing he's getting ripped off. So that's basically it in a nutshell. Now what they do say is that about the month of April 1893, your orator, being Gerard Riddell, joined William Green at Liverpool and accompanied him to the city of Chicago, where the said William Green then professed to reside. The expenses of said trip were defrayed, as your order is informed and believed by the said William Green, out of funds so entrusted to him for the use of your order. Very legal use. But so what I did, since he was nice enough to say exactly what month and year they came, I went to the ship manifest to see if I could find Gerard Riddell on the ship manifest. And lo and behold, there was a ship that arrived at New York at the date that they said they did, and there's Gerard Riddell on the ship manifest. There's only a problem. There's one problem with his ship manifest. Can anyone see what the issue would be? Yeah, the age, 31. He couldn't have been any older than 18 at this point because he just got out of Mount St. Mary's School. You know who was exactly 31 years old? Holmes. So I don't think Riddell ever made it to the United States. I think Holmes was probably William Green or one of his associates, and he was somebody else. And they convinced this father to let them bring the kid to the United States, but then got rid of him sometime before they got to Liverpool. And then one of them posed as the young boy so that if they ever had any doubt whether or not he came to the United States, it would be on the ship manifests. Because at that point, you could lie about a name that you're using. You had no ID. So if you were traveling in a ship from here to there, you can give them any name you wanted, and that's what they would put on the manifest. And you didn't need a passport at the time. You did not. So there was no official documentation. So there's Gerard Riddell, who was supposed to be 18 years old. And lo and behold, there's William Green. He's 28. So Green is actually younger than Riddell. Now, Patrick Quinlan, who was a close associate of Holmes, was about 28 years old at the time. So I'm thinking the two of them left, and rather than 3 coming back, only 2 came back, and Gerard Riddell never made it to the United States. But the problem is that now you've got 2 criminals, possibly 1 using 2 different names. Now they're getting this money from England, and they're just sending letters back and forth saying that they need more money. And I think one criminal actually tried to steal money from Holmes. I think he actually tried to get off with the money, and then Holmes used one of his notaries to file documents posing as Gerard Riddell again to try to get an arrest warrant issued for Green, so he couldn't hightail it, or whoever Green was, hightail it out of there with the money. Because it eventually went into a safety deposit box. And then that safety deposit box, the money was transferred by Holmes to a different safety deposit box. And then when somebody else went to go get the money, it was gone. So they had to try to, there's no honor among thieves. And he was living in Inglewood. So again, Holmes was operating in the Inglewood neighborhood. So this has Holmes written all over it. Now they also mentioned another guy by the name of Henry Rogers. And again, I'm like, who's this Rogers guy? Is it a real guy? Is it, remember there always has to be a dupe involved in any sort of thing. And of course, in this thing, he said that your order cannot repeat, here it is, let's see, the full terms and substance of which said receipt your order is unable to give, but in which was incorporated a reference to your order cannot repeat the certain notes given to said Green by one Rogers, and your order being ignorant business of his business to said relied upon. So it's all a bunch of legalese, but basically he's saying that some of these notes were given over to a guy named Rogers. So then I'm like, okay, Henry Rogers, Holmes alias, Holmes Confederate, who was he? Well, in the newspaper again, there was a Henry J. Rogers that's supposed to be Appleton, Wisconsin, who bought the property for the warehouse William Green Company that was on the Chicago River. So I was kind of on the hunt for Henry Rogers, but the lucky thing is that they mentioned where he was from, Appleton, Wisconsin. Now, when I searched in Appleton, Wisconsin, they do mention a lot more about Rogers, Henry Rogers, his business, the description of the actual warehouse during the real estate sale that happened on October 9th, 1892. Again, William Green and Company. So Henry James Rogers ends up being a real person. So as I'm researching Henry J. Rogers, he ends up being a bigwig in Appleton, Wisconsin. So he had a lot of money, he was a banker, he owned a paper mill, and somehow Rogers and Holmes got introduced, and to this other person possibly named William Green. And I contacted them, and his home is now a museum. He got married in 1860 in Denver. He had a daughter named Florence Kitty Talbot. Moved to Appleton in about 1873. He was the manager of the Appleton Paper and Pulp Company, and his home is named Hearthstone, was built in 1882. This is a picture of the home now. I contacted the museum, and I said I just wanted to find out more information about Henry Rogers because I think he was a victim of H.H. Holmes. And they're like, we'd never heard any of that. And they said, we just thought he moved to Chicago and he just gambled his money away. And I said, no, he was the one holding the bag when Holmes skipped town and William Green, if it was a separate person, skipped town. And all the bills for all the cement and stuff they were ordering fell on him. So he basically ended up paying a huge amount of money to different debtors or companies. And that's actually how he lost a big portion of his money. So I actually went up there, gave a talk about Henry Rogers and his involvement with Holmes, got to kind of tour the house. It was really neat. It was actually the first house ever lit using an Edison distributed generator. So it's like all the original fixtures are in the house, all the original switches, really kind of a neat thing. Now there is a link that I found while I was doing the research that actually put Holmes with the World's Fair a little bit closer, at least the people from the World's Fair, and that is the fact that, well, first of all, Hearthstone was built by architect was William Waters, who actually did the Wisconsin building for for the World's Fair, so they do look a little bit similar. And that's a postcard of the World's Fair Wisconsin building. But it involves the Rookery building. Is everyone familiar with the Rookery building downtown? Daniel Burnham, John Root built it in 1888, I believe. And their offices were on the top floor. So while the World's Fair was being created, Burnham and Root had their offices on the 11th floor, the top floor of this building. There he is, there's Daniel Burnham. So anyone familiar with the World's Fair knows about Daniel Burnham. Now Daniel Burnham in the Chicago City Directive 1892, it shows his address was 1142, the Rookery building. That was his work address. 11th floor, room 42, I'm assuming. Now there was also a business that had an office located on the 11th floor of the Rookery building, which was the William Green & Company. So I was always wondering how, when this movie eventually comes out about the Devil in the White City, you know that at some point in this movie you're going to see Holmes and Burnham bump into each other, or brush shoulders or something. You know, somehow they're going to try to incorporate that even closer than Eric Larson did. So the building had elevators at the time, and you know, if Holmes was operating out of the 11th floor, there was a chance that Burnham and Holmes may have ridden the elevator together up and down in this building. Of course, they probably wouldn't have known him as Holmes, maybe as William Green. We don't know. But yeah, they were at 1142 and Holmes was over at 1169. So there you go. They could have compared mustaches on the elevator. And Henry Rogers was involved. So that was just one. Now the interesting thing is that when Holmes made his confession, this is a portion of the confession that was published in the newspapers, first by the Hearst newspapers, and then every newspaper after that kind of covered it. But he confessed to 27 murders. Now the thing about Holmes is that he lied about everything, even if he didn't have to. He was a compulsive, almost a sickness. So in his confession, the people that he claimed to murder were still alive, and the people that he said he didn't murder were gone. So in other words, you knew he was lying if his mouth was moving. So in his confession, he mentions William Green in a way. He doesn't mention his name, but he does mention the guy from Wisconsin, Rogers. And in his confession, he said, in 1891, I associated myself in business with a young Englishman whose name I am more willing to publish to the world, but I'm advised it could not be published on my unsupported statement. So he's writing this, he knows he's going to be hung in probably a month. He's already been convicted, but he's worried about being sued civilly for mentioning the guy's name. Right? Yeah, no, yeah, go figure, yeah. William Green didn't exist. He was another Holmes alias. But anyway, so he said, I'm advised that it could not be published on my unsupported statement, who by his own admission had been guilty of all other forms of wrongdoing, save murder, and presumably that as well. So he's basically bum-rapping this Englishman, and we all know that's William Green. And he said that him and Green had murdered Henry Rogers in order to get money or force him to sign documents. So he said, but he made it seem like it was Green's idea. So basically he says that he lured, I won't read the whole thing to you, but basically they lured, in his confession, he said that Green and him lured Henry Rogers into the secret room of his castle, put him in a trunk, and then started putting gas into the trunk enough to make him nauseous but not kill him, and then open the trunk and say, sign this. And then if he signed it, you know, they'd let him go. And if he didn't sign it, they close the trunk again, they start pumping more gas, and they just keep making him sick over and over again until he signed the document. And then supposedly he eventually signs the document, and then both him and Green are like walking out, and they both look at each other and say, you know, we can't let him just live now, right? And then so Green supposedly says, you know, that you know, he let Green decide whether or not Rogers would have to die. And Green decided that they would kill them, and then Holmes said, well, let me chloroform them first. And you know, this whole, it was all bogus, because Henry Rogers was alive. You know, he wasn't dead. In fact, he died 3 months after Holmes was executed. But yeah, so the whole thing was made up. It was a great story, but he didn't want to make himself out to look too bad. He said, here we go. Finally, by alternately starving him and nauseating him with the gas, he was made to sign the securities, all of which were converted into money, and by my partner's skill as a forger in such a manner as to leave no trace of their having passed through our hands. So, but yeah, but the unfortunate thing, I mean, the fortunate thing is that Henry Rogers was still alive. So, like I said, most of the confession was bogus. Holmes was hanged on May 7th, 1896. Happy Holmes Execution Day again. And he is buried in a unmarked grave at Holy Cross. He converted to Catholicism while he was in prison, so he was able to be buried in a Catholic cemetery. But he wanted to be buried in a casket in a vault filled with cement. So he didn't want anyone to be able to dig him up like he used to dig up bodies and sell skeletons. So he wanted the casket filled with cement and the vault filled with cement. So that's what they did. They actually honored his wishes, so he is in a really big block of cement somewhere in this area here where you don't see any tombstones. Now the Holmes Castle was torn down in 1938. Now there's a post office there. You know, I did get a chance to meet Jeff Mudgett, who is his great-grandson, and I told him I was going to be talking about his grandfather today. And he seems to think that you know, he's been trying for a long time to get them to excavate underneath the post office to look for other bodies. And I keep telling him that there's no other bodies under the post office because Holmes would have gotten rid of them or sold them. And so we go back and forth where, I mean, we're friends. I can talk about Jack the Ripper. He says that Holmes is Jack the Ripper. I say his MO is completely different. He was too busy in Chicago in 1888 to be tromping around Whitechapel district in London, killing prostitutes and leaving them mutilated on the ground. And then his answer to that was, what do you think a serial killer does on vacation? So, anyhow, I'm serious about that. That's not a joke. I'm like, oh, come on. But anyway, so it's a good story. Nobody's ever caught Jack the Ripper, so it could be anyone. It could be my grandfather for all I know. But anyway, so the idea that the Holmes Castle is built on the exact same location doesn't really fly, because I took an old Sanborn fire map of where the castle was, and then I superimposed it on a Google map, and it lined up almost completely perfectly. And then I did a little outlay of, so this in green is actually the Holmes, or the post office as it is now, and the Holmes Castle would have been here. So there's a chance that they might have shared one wall underground, like maybe a basement wall. But other than that, anything that was in the underneath Holmes Castle would be in the parking lot, not actually in the post office. Henry Rogers did die within 3 months of Holmes being executed, which is one of the things they say there's a Holmes curse, that anyone had anything to do with Holmes who testified against him or provided information against him would suddenly be dead long after he was dead. Something about a Holmes curse. And he did die of 3 months after Holmes was executed of cancer. And he's buried at Graceland Cemetery. He lived in Wisconsin, but he's buried at Graceland Cemetery, which Thomas Barber Bryan owned the land for Graceland Cemetery before it was a cemetery. And Thomas Barber Bryan was also a victim of Holmes, but he was a swindle victim of Holmes. So it gets pretty convoluted. And he was also the vice president of the World's Congress Auxiliary at the World's Fair. So Henry Rogers is buried there with his wife, Cremorum. They just have 2 little stones out in the middle of a patch of ground at Graceland. And his home still lives on in Appleton. And there's a picture of Jeff Mudgett. I don't think he looks at all like his grandfather. He's actually about 6'3", and Holmes was about 5'7" and a half, I think. But Jeff's actually a really nice guy, luckily. Of course, I've never been with him in one room with just him and me in the room. But he actually wrote a book called Bloodstains, and I'm not making any money for plugging this book. It's a very well-written book. He considers it a work of nonfiction. I consider it a work of fiction, but we have, differing. Basically, he said that he found out he was related to Holmes when he was 40 years old, and that he found out from his grandfather. And right after he found out, he started having epileptic seizures. And during these seizures, Holmes would talk to him. And that's how he found out that he wasn't executed at Moy-Mensing prison. And he mentioned that there was a diary that he found in an old fishing tackle box in one of the garages in a little secret false bottom compartment. In there was Holmes's diary that was dated through like 1950. And So I've tried a couple times to call him on that and say, well, if you got this diary, you know, Smithsonian would be interested in it, and a couple of these, and he just wouldn't answer me. And I said, when I was giving the tour over in Jackson Park, I said, how much of this book is fiction and how much is fact? And he's like, well, it's about 90% fact. But which 90% you have to guess. So, but it was still a well-written book, and it was kind of an interesting book to read. So now we're going to we're going to come a little bit forward, because I want to get into criminal and corrections records, parole records, coroner's inquest records, which takes us into more modern times. And of course, Holmes was tried in Philadelphia and died in 1896, executed. So I can't use him as the case study for those type of records, because he was never charged with anything in Chicago. So we're going to switch gears, and we're going to go over criminal records. And also at the Cook County Archives, Court Archives, they have, and we're only talking about felonies here, so if it's a misdemeanor thing, they're not going to have any records on it. Misdemeanors you can have wiped off your record completely after 3 years, and they have no reason to hang on to them. Felony records stick with you like luggage. So if you're convicted of a felony, it stays on forever. So those are the type of records we're talking about. And I don't think you'd be interested in like your relatives' traffic tickets or anything like that. Although they do have them, and there are some good genealogical information, but no index. So good luck. But it's on your thing. It would be a nice project if you have a historical society looking for a project to actually index the old municipal court files, which are mainly traffic related. But when they posted bond, they didn't like hand them a license and post bond or money. You had to actually have someone come out, and they had to fill out these huge forms, and there's a whole lot of genealogical information on these bond forms. So but unless you knew exactly when they got pulled over or whatever, you wouldn't be able to find that until it's indexed. We're going to talk about John Anarino and the Guardian Angel Spiritual Church. And you're like, what the heck are you talking about? When I wrote the first book, Chicago's Haunt Detective, I came across this case by accident, and which is how a lot of stuff is discovered by accident. Some of the good stuff is by accident. And I had never heard about this case. It's fairly recent, 1985, and it involved John Anarino, who is a manager at City Hall in Chicago. And basically, in a nutshell, John Anarino was not a really nice guy, and was a manager down at City Hall, and I think in the clerk's office. And I have not run into anyone yet who knew him, and they probably don't want to let on that they knew him. But in addition to being a manager at City Hall, he started this church in his house, and he called it the Guardian Angel Spiritual Church. And of course, he was the leader of the church, and so he could get a lot of freebies because he registered as a church, like his license plates were free and a lot of other stuff was free. So what they used to do is have seances at his house, and they called it the Guardian Angel Spiritual Church. So you'd bring people over, and they'd have a psychic basically talk to you about your dead relatives and whatnot, in calling it a church. And then when they weren't having church sessions, they were having male nude oil wrestling. So now you see, when I was reading this, I'm like, oh no, I gotta know more about this. So, and it gets really good. So, but it's a nice case study for looking through these records. So this was his house over at 515 West 28th Place. I'm sorry if anyone lives there now. You may be wondering why the basement has this oily film on the floor, but that's the house, and just a small little house. That's where the church was. And so what happened? He's a manager here at City Hall, and so what happened was he was out at a local bar, and he became boyfriends with a guy, and he met him at the bar, and his last name was Fisher, and he introduced himself and said, by the way, I work for the city, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I'm also a minister of a church. And at that point, I think most people would be like, oh, that's really great. And then slipped out the back door without him knowing what was going on. But he said, I'm also a minister of a church. And then he said, oh yeah, I'm also a minister myself. So I'm thinking, okay, this is weird. And so they have a falling out. They don't get along anymore. Fisher decides to move out of his house. And now they've got this antagonistic relationship. And Anarino is so mad he wants to have him killed. So what he does is he goes out and he hires 3 guys to go kill his ex-boyfriend. And so one of the guys is this guy here, Dwayne Coulter. And there were 2 other guys involved, but Dwayne Coulter, I just chose him because he got the longest sentence, so I assumed he was the one, that got charged with most of it. So I used him as kind of a case study. And the Department of Corrections actually has a site. Let me go back here. There we go. So people who are currently in prison or who are currently on parole, you can actually look them up on the web. You can go to the IDOC website and you can just run a name and they'll pop people up and you can see something like this where you see their picture, you know what scars, marks, tattoos they have, all that stuff. Now that disappears the minute they're off parole. It's no longer considered public information, only while they're incarcerated. But you can go to IODC. Now what happened is the 3 yo-yos that he hired to go do this, the plan was that they called the guy the day before, and they said that they were investigators with the state because he was behind in his mortgage payments, and that they needed to talk to him, and he needed to be home at 9:30 the next morning for them to talk to him. Well, I mean, he knew he wasn't behind in his mortgage payments, and his house had been vandalized once before. So he assumed that someone had an axe to grind against him. So he called the Cook County Sheriff's Police, and he said, "I think someone's out to get me." And so they said, "We'll put an extra watch on your house." Well, Michael Ridges was the Cook County Sheriff who was in the area when all this was going on, and he saw a description of a car that matched the description that was put out on the radio, and he pulls it over, and it ends up being this Dwayne Coulter and 2 of his accomplices, and they end up shooting and killing Michael Ridges. So he dies in the line of duty investigating these death threats against John Anarino's ex-boyfriend. So and eventually the guys give up John Anarino. They said, "It wasn't our idea. This guy from the city hired us to go kill his boyfriend." And so right away they go arrest John Anarino, or they get an arrest warrant for him. On the day that he was supposed to turn himself in on the warrant, John Anarino comes up with a brilliant idea of his other brilliant ideas, and he hires a local handyman and says, "This is what we're going to do. I'm going to turn myself in on this arrest warrant," but he wants to taint the jury pool. He wants to build some sympathy up for him. So he says, "What I want you to do is when I come out of I'll call you right before I'm about to leave my house, and you're going to drive by and you're going to shoot me. And we're going to blame it on my ex-boyfriend." Whatever. But I'm trying to put myself in the room with these 2 guys during this conversation. But the one guy goes, "Well, where do you want me to shoot you? How about like the arm or the leg?" And he says, "No, you got to make it look good." And he goes, "Okay." So he calls him up, and he's coming down the stairs, and sure enough, the guy he hired to shoot him drives by, and he shoots him, hits him in the stomach, kills him. Good thing is he didn't have to go to prison. So now I'm thinking about the police actually investigating this, going, who do we arrest? Who do we charge? Who's the bad guy here? I don't know. But so this poor guy Rubio is, of course now he turns himself in. He says, I didn't mean to kill the guy. He hired me to shoot him, so I shot him. I don't know if there's a law against that. I don't. He didn't go to jail. Maybe aggravated discharge. Maybe you didn't have a permit for the gun. I don't know. But literally, if I walk up to someone and say, punch me in the face, and they hit me in the face, there's nothing I can do about it. I gave you permission. So anyway, so when you're looking up criminal files, what you do is you go down to the same place you go down to look up the other stuff at the courthouse. And they're actually on microfiche. They're not in very good, they're in good shape, but the like you can see on the slide, this was one of the better printings that are on the slide. These are all handwritten. So what I suggest when you go down there and you're looking up the name of an individual, and again, it's by date first. There is no master. You can't just go down there and say, I want to look up all the felony files for Ray Johnson, you have to know what year roughly it was. So you're going to be looking through a lot of microfiche, which is, again, the cool thing about doing this is that most people don't want to do the work and you don't get the cool information. So you go down there, you look through by year and then by last name, and it's not completely alphabetical. So if you're in the C's, you're going to have to look through all the C's, even though it's somewhat in good alphabetical order. Sometimes you'll see things out of order, so it's best to look through it all. And bring a magnifying glass and your best reading glasses, because there's no printout and it's really poor quality. So, and a lot of times I got to put readers on and then take the magnifying glass to it at the same time to actually look for it. But once you get the case number, you can order that, and then you're going to get the actual original case file from that particular felony case. Now with Dwayne Coulter, it was interesting because with Dwayne Coulter, they had already done his whole family history. Because part of the thing is that they had hired a psychologist to go through and kind of convince people he came from a broken home and to have sympathy on him. So they actually hired his attorney, hired people to come in and do his whole background, his whole family history. So it was already kind of written, not all that far back, but a lot of detail as far as what his parents did. There were military documents. He was in the military. There was actually a copy of his discharge papers there. All of the punishments he received in the military, Article 15s, stuff like that. A lot of information, what units he was in. So you're going to get a lot of information that you may not be able to get from other sources. And there was also, there may be some police reports, which, you know, you're not going to get generally police reports from the city of Chicago. I know it's supposed to be public information, so don't yell at me and say, all I have to do is fill out a Freedom of Information Act and they have to give me the copy of the police reports. Yeah, no. They've got teams of attorneys that will work tooth and nail so that you don't get them. And I'm even a former cop, and I called friends and said, can I have a copy of this report? And they're like, yeah, we don't give out copies of reports. I said, even if I fill out a FOIA form and come in, they said, well, you can, but we don't give anyone copies of the reports. Okay. But sometimes when you go through these court cases, there are copies of police reports included in the court file. This particular one was on another case where a woman, it's in one of the books that I've written about Teresita Basa, who was murdered in Chicago in the 1970s. And they caught the bad guy because a coworker of the woman started having trances and was channeling supposedly the spirit of the dead woman, and gave the police information like what stuff was stolen from her apartment, and the names and phone numbers of the relatives that could come and actually identify the jewelry. So really interesting. Teresita Basa, which, you know, generally the psychic information isn't that specific. You know, and I see the letter C, I see a body of water, I see a bridge, you know, not here's the guy's name and phone number, call him up, and this is, I mean, so that was really good, but that's why I was really interested in it. But anyway, so you may have copies of police reports and transcripts. And criminal files, like I said, are like a box of chocolates, because you really never know what you're going to find when you look in these files. So sometimes you can be surprised. Now, if it was settled out of court, you might just have a docket. Now, all files should have a docket. A docket is basically just the main summary of the case and little notes here and there about what motions were filed, and kind of like a very brief summary of the different court dates that were taking place during. Now, if a case was settled and it didn't go to trial, there's not going to be a whole lot of information on there. Once the guy pleads guilty and it's over, there's not a lot of testimony. So you may only have a docket. But there will also be an indictment regardless. So the indictments are actually on a separate microfilm. Now, they are very helpful there. If you say what you're looking for, they'll help you find it. They'll even help you find the indictments. And the indictments are there on microfilm. So the files from 1900 through 1927 were destroyed. One of the judges at Cook County decided it was a good idea to get rid of all the criminal files from 1900 to 1927. Go figure, those were like the biggest mob years. And they thought that that would be a good idea to just destroy all those files. So I'm sure it was just to save space. But the indictments will be there, the indictments and the dockets. And on the indictments, you'll get pretty much the gist of the whole crime. Because in the indictment is basically when the prosecutor comes before the grand jury and presents their case. So you're going to get the victim's name, you're going to get the circumstances surrounding the crime. In this case, it was, the victim's name I've underlined. This was another case I was working on for a client. Michael Cunningham, and you'll get people that they were with during the crime, that they committed the crime, addresses, everything they would need in order to get a true bill or an indictment for the crime. So you're going to get a lot of specifics. That could lead you to other resources. When you have addresses, you have locations, you have businesses, you have associates and whatnot. Now what you will find at the end of all the documents is what the end result is of the case. Were they found guilty? Did they plead guilty? Were they found not guilty? And did they go to the penitentiary? Which leads you to a separate group of documents altogether. So if they went to prison, and I'm not talking about jail, because there was jail too. Jail is a different thing. Jail is where they put you while you're on trial, or unless you're convicted of a misdemeanor, that's a year or less of jail time. So if it's a misdemeanor, you're not going to find it, and you're not going to get much from jail records either. But the Department of Corrections, you will. And in this case, it says sentenced on verdict to penitentiary. And generally, they're talking about Joliet, although we did have a number of other prisons. I mentioned about the Illinois Department of Corrections inmate search. This only corresponds to people who are currently in prison or on parole. But if you want to get the older records, you have to contact the Illinois State Archives. The State Archives has all the prison records for the state of Illinois, going back as far as the prisons existed. And they also have the parole records, because if someone's in prison, then they're going to be on parole. And when they're on parole, there's a bunch of other documents that are created as part of that. These are the two major groups of records that the Illinois State Archives has. One is the record group 243, which is the Department of Corrections. It includes stuff for Menard, Pontiac, Stateville, Joliet, Dwight, Centralia, Alton, some dating back as far as 1869, all the way through 1978. Now, of course, these are archives. The Department of Corrections has their own current information, but for that you'd have to fill out a Freedom of Information Act form, and I put in your handouts who those contact people are. And they also have Parole and Pardon Board. Now it's called the Prisoner Review Board, but those go from 1893 to 1965. Now there's this is a Department of Corrections form. A lot of it, some you may find photographs, some you may not. It all depends on the age frame or what time frame they actually spent time in prison. But there's a lot of information on these forms. I mean, they'll have date of birth as much as they can be determined. Sometimes they'll just have age. They didn't have, a lot of times, have a birth certificate or a driver's license handy. So they would just go by what the person said as far as age. But a good physical description, any scars, marks, tattoos, what religion they were, their address, what their occupation was at the time they were arrested, and all that good stuff. This is typical stuff that would be included in a corrections packet. Name, age, physical, birthplace, which is nice, education, where father and mother were born, marital status, number of children, occupation, whether or not the parents were living, their religion, their associates, when assigned and where to prison, their punishment record. In other words, if they got in trouble while they were in prison, they'll have that type of information, and their parole dates and where they were paroled to. So they had to keep track of where they were going once they were released. And then when you get these files, the best way to do that is actually, I just contact the State Archives directly, and if you live in Illinois, they'll make copies for you for free and send them to you via mail. I just sent an email. The email's on your handouts. John Reinhardt is the person that I am usually dealing with. He just happens to be the guy that, he's one of the supervisors there, but every time I send an email, it's he who responds, so I don't know how many people they have working there, but he's really a great guy. And if you have the information, he has the indexes, he'll look it up for you and he'll mail it to you, which is really nice, and it doesn't cost anything. And so when you get these files, you have to read every little notation because there's clues in all this stuff. And in this little kind of handwritten note in the lower left-hand side, it says, out to brother's funeral, 9/15/24, received same day. So in other words, you know that his brother died or at least had a funeral on a particular date, and this helps you, for other reasons. You may be trying to decide if this is your relative, and you may know that his brother did die on this date, so you know for sure that this is the guy. In the case there's no birth date and there's more than one Michael Cunningham who was in prison. So some of these things help you sort out one prisoner from another. The other one is the Parole and Pardon Board. And these are documents that were created generally to be issued to the pardon board to see whether or not they were going to be released back into society while they were still serving out their sentence. So when you were on parole, you were still technically property of the Department of Corrections. You're just allowed to serve the rest of your sentence out here amongst everyone else. So it's kind of like you have to prove that you should be paroled, so you have parole hearings. And what they do is they actually make these parole prediction reports where they interview them and they get a full background on them, and then they present it to the board. And so there's a lot of genealogical information within here, stuff about their demeanor, what their interests are, what they like. So there's a lot of stuff in here. And again, it's like a box of chocolates when you're talking about parole prediction reports. Now, they also give a percentage on what the chances are that this guy's going to go out, or gal is going to go out and be back soon. And so they give a percentage. Like in this case, the inmate is in the class in which 46% may be expected to violate the parole agreement, 27% may be expected to commit serious or repeat infractions, and 19% may be expected to commit new offenses while on parole. And like I said, there's a lot of information. It's usually a number of pages long, and it includes family history, educational history, military history, marital history, criminal history, institutional adjustment, and work history. So there's a lot of information in there. Now here's the negative about the whole thing. They're technically in Illinois considered restricted records. So this is the way around, if you can say, around that restriction. And it's not necessarily easy. It's a little time consuming, but you can do it. And like a lot of other records in Illinois, they don't like to release records that they don't need to, because I think everyone's worried about getting sued or whatever. But now both corrections and parole are under a 75-year rule, meaning they have to be 75 years older or more before they'll release them, unless you go through the Freedom of Information Act, and then they have to tell you a reason why they can't give it to you. So you can fill out those types of forms, and those contact information are in your forms. Now, both could be subject to the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Confidentiality Act, which is what we ran into. I was doing work for a New York Times writer who's writing a book on well, I can't really say what it's about because I'm under a gag order, but she's looking for an individual who was paroled in the 1950s. So we're already past we're not within the 75-year rule. And when we initially applied to get the parole records, we had to talk to Ken Tupi, who's in charge of, he's on your contact list there. He's probably going to hate me that I'm giving this out, but anytime you want the parole records, you have to go through him, even if it's not 75 years old. So if you're looking for parole stuff, you got to write to Ken Tupi, say, I would like this person's parole record. And then he writes to John Reinhardt over at the Illinois State Archives and says, yes, you can release all the information except for that we consider subject to the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Act, which means they consider it psychological treatment files, which I don't have a problem with that, but none of these people were psychologically treated, and I really don't care if they were. We're just interested in the parole prediction reports, which should be public information because you're making decisions in the interest of public safety based on whether or not you think this person should be released to the public. So we went back and forth, and we actually had to appeal to the Illinois State Attorney General because we were originally turned down, and when the Attorney General's office looked at it, they said, no, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to get these. So they wrote a letter back to the Illinois State Archives, and we got what we were looking for, but it took a couple months to go through the steps and procedures to do that. And then again, no good information is necessarily easy to get, and you just have to put a little work into it. But then I contacted them and said, well, since they've already said now that the records should be released, do we still have to go through this process every time? And they said yes. So, unless they change the law. And this was the law. All records and communications shall be confidential and should not be disclosed except as provided in this act unless otherwise expressly provided for in this act. Records and communications made or created in the course of providing mental health or developmental disability services shall be protected from disclosure regardless of whether the records and communications are made or created in the course of a therapeutic relationship. So in legalese, they were trying to, it was a good reason for the law in that if you're seeing a therapist, that information should be kept confidential unless it's a criminal investigation or subpoenaed or whatnot. but the general public shouldn't just be able to get the records that you have with your psychologist or whatever. But these records did not fall into that, although they were worried that it might. So that's why they're protected. So on your, you don't have to copy this down. This is on your handouts. If you want to get a hold of, now this doesn't involve the DOC, the actual correctional records. Those are released once they're 75 years or older. There's no question whatsoever you can get those. If they're newer, you just have to fill out a different form, a Freedom of Information Act form, and then they can more or less make the decision to release them. Generally, they will. And if you have a death certificate, that helps. So if the person that, I mean, obviously if the person's alive, they probably won't let you have the records if it's not considered public information. But if you do have a death certificate, that helps. So if you're beyond that 75-year rule and it's newer, but you know the person's deceased, then if you provide a copy of the death certificate with the Freedom of Information Act, they should be able to then write to the National Archive or State Archives and get them released to you, if that makes any sense. And then the Freedom of Information Act for IDOC, which you have a copy, so you don't have to write that down. And that's the general information to the State Archives, which you also have. So, and I want to try to end this at 4, so that I can take some questions and kind of be out in the hall and do what we need to do. So the last thing I want to talk about is coroner's or medical examiner's office records. This is a photograph of the coroner's inquest during the Grimes sisters murder case of 1956, and that's something that I'm really involved with. Even with the family, we're trying to research the case, come up with new leads, and then hopefully write a book to generate money for a reward, because in the course of the research we found that there's probably 3 individuals that we know by name that still have information regarding the unsolved murder. So, and we are working with the Cook County Sheriff's Office as far as when we come up with information, we give it to them. But they're so bogged down right now that it's difficult for them to spend time on an old case. But as far as coroners and medical examiners' records, this is what a coroner's inquest looked like. We no longer have coroners in Cook County, we have medical examiners. And the reason for that is a lot of what happened during the 1950s and 60s is that a lot of cases were not solved, and so they didn't like the coroners, the whole way that was set up. Because the coroner is an elected individual that doesn't even need a medical background. And they had other doctors that did the actual autopsies. And the coroner was an elected official who held a public hearing to determine cause of death. And that's why the coroner's records are public information. It was like a court case. You can see they had the newspapers and cameras going at the time. So it was a public hearing. Now, you can you can go to the website, which is on your handouts, for the medical examiner's office. Now, they do have all the coroner's inquest files. Again, not really easy to get. In fact, there was one time I was applying for a coroner's inquest file, and it took like 6 months. I said, it might take 6 months. I contacted them after 6 months. I said, we still don't have it. By about the 3rd or 4th time I called, the person on the phone said, how old are you? And at the time, I think I said I was 45. And they said, well, you should have it when you're 80. So we're dealing with Cook County here. So, but, and I wrote letters to all the officials, and of course they went in the waste paper basket. And, but supposedly, according to their website, they're very good at giving out reports, but it's going to cost you. So, in fact, with the Grimes case, I was there with the brother of one of the murdered girls. And the testimony in that case was, I think, 1,200 pages. And so they wanted to charge us $5 a page for a copy. So it was basically going to be close to $5 grand for us to get a copy of this report. And we're talking about the family of the murdered girls. So they said, maybe you should have a fundraiser. So anyway, so lots of fun dealing with them. Sorry if anyone's from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. Yeah, don't. But not really. But supposedly you can get all this. It's on their website as far as the cost. Autopsy reports, $50, toxicology reports, all that kind of stuff. Because technically dead people don't have a right to privacy, supposedly. Now, one thing you can find, they have all of them there. What used to happen is that if you knew, you checked the newspaper, you knew there was a coroner's inquest. In fact, maybe their death certificate said coroner's death certificate. So you knew there was an inquest. and you'd go down there and you'd look through these books and it would tell you the volume, the page number, and then you'd put in your order and you'd never get it. So, but you're supposed to get it. And now I guess there's been some turnaround in the management there. So maybe it is a little better than what I'm saying. So just, yeah, always try. But they do have the records. I had put like this scathing article on Chicago Now because they had this press that they were so happy with themselves because they found an old coroner's inquest from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And I'm like, well, big deal. They're supposed to have that. That's what their job is, to keep charge of those records. So then I went on and I made lots of enemies over there. So I was like, oh, have you seen this article? That's like the Library of Congress going, look, we found a book. So again, sorry if you're from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. But so anyway, but the older coroner's inquest records have an index to them, which doesn't really help you a lot other than the fact that it gives you the volume, the page number already. But you can go on the Illinois State Archives website and find out if there was a coroner's inquest and the date it was filed and the volume and page number of that. If it's after 1911, you actually have to go down there and say that you want a copy of a coroner's inquest. And if you're lucky enough to let you look through the books, and then you find your volume and page number and then fill out all the forms that you need to fill out. They did, now what they are required by law to let you do is to look through the file on site at no cost. So we actually I had the brother of the girls contact them, because who am I, right? And he called and said, or wrote him a letter saying that he would like to review the file. So they made copies of the 1,200 pages, and we went down there with 4 people, and they said, you have 90 minutes to look through it. And so we sat in the room with someone from the medical examiner's office who sat in the room with us, taking notes on all these 1,200 pages of what we could, and then if we didn't purchase it for $5,000 or whatever, then they were going to shred them all. So, yeah. So we took. Luckily, I had another author that had a partial listing, and she gave me a copy, and I was able to copy some of it. But there's a lot of information on the coroner's inquest as far as addresses, names, birthdays, just a ton of information. And of course, the testimony of the different people trying to prove what the cause of death was. Now there is the Chicago homicide records of the Chicago Police Department, which the originals are housed at the Northeastern University, IRAD. But if you go to the website that was done by Northwestern University, they do have homicide records in Chicago from 1870 to 1930, and it's just the basics. And that's pretty much, I talked to the woman who designed the website, and she said that all the information that's at Northeastern would be on this website. So there's nothing secret that they didn't put on the website. And so it's just the basic information, who the victim of the homicide was, if there was any suspects, and the circumstances behind it. Generally not a lot of information, but decent enough to where if you were going to look in the newspapers, you'd have a date range to look for. And then, of course, the FBI has their own archives. A lot of their famous cases they already have online. And we had a really good amount of luck with the FBI as far as Freedom of Information Act. So if you do fill out a form and you have some FBI files on that you think may have been kept on somebody, they're really, really good, surprisingly, at providing that information with just a normal Freedom of Information Act request, and they're usually pretty quick about it. In fact, we sent for all the files that they might have had on the Grimes case, because they were involved, because there were some ransom notes involved, and so they were brought in because it could have been a kidnapping case. It ended up being a murder case. But they sent us all the copies of reports that they had on the Grimes case with certain things redacted. So if there's names that they thought these people could still be alive, or maybe there was an informant they were using and they didn't want their name put out there, they would redact the information. But sometimes they mess up and you'll see the name later on, and they missed it. So they're not perfect either. But and then, of course, we're going to end. This would be an entire class on itself, and we don't have time to get into this. But the National Archives Great Lake region, has anyone been to the National Archives Great Lakes region? Okay, a number of people. Great people that work there. I've worked with them forever. I volunteered there a number of years ago. And they have all of the federal court cases, criminal cases, circuit cases going back to 1870 too because of the fire, because the federal courthouse was in Chicago as well, so they lost a lot of stuff in the fire. In fact, they have one document, one surviving piece of paper from the federal, one court case that actually, one page of one court case that wasn't burned, and they have it there, and I was going to take some pictures of it. But they have all the circuit court cases from federal courts, bankruptcy cases, just a ton of information. They have indexes to all of it. Really, really great. The indexes are on microfilm, but if you want to look through the original case files, you have to get a card, register for a card. You could do it the same day. Normally what I'll do is if you have a suspicion you have someone who might be in some of these files, I would contact them via email, which that information's in your handout, and it's also on their webpage, and let them know you're planning on coming down there, and they can have the records pulled ahead of time, so when you get down there, they'll be waiting for you. But they have all the federal court cases, criminal, civil, you name it, they've got it there. And not just for Illinois. I mean, they cover Indiana, they cover Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. And like I said, it would take forever to just go into everything that they had. So, and we're going to go ahead and end with that. This is their address on 73rd South Pulaski, but you've got that in your handouts. That is it. So if you want to learn more about me, you can go on Chicago Now, sign up for my blog. I don't post a lot because I usually do a lot of research. I'm not like the typical blogger that puts something out every day complaining about something that gets like 1 million hits because they're talking about something political. I'll take like 2 or 3 weeks to research something, put it on there, and might get 30 people looking at it. But I like to do it. So if you go to Chicago Now, look up Chicago History Cop. You can just put your email in. You'll get emailed if I put out a blog post. That's my email. I have no problem. I'm going to be sitting out at the table outside. I've got some of the books that I've written. Don't feel like you need to buy anything. Just grab one of my cards. If you have any questions, email me. I have no problem answering any questions. So, all right. Thanks.
Fantastic. All right, thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you so much. You should take a bow. That was really good.
Yeah.
So thank you all, everyone, for coming out to our Genealogy Day program. For our participants online, thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to forward or to share the videos that we have available on YouTube, because they will be available later. So if you missed anything in person, go home. You can watch them on YouTube. Download the handouts if you forget, and throw them away. But we wish you all a really happy Mother's Day tomorrow, and please have a lovely day. So to our online participants, we bid you adieu as we go to our question and answer period. Thank you.